On May 14, 2016, at 10:15 in the morning, a truck driver traveling on Highway 159 in Nevada slammed on the brakes. In the middle of the hot desert road, a girl staggered along. She was barefoot, her skin looked like parchment from numerous burns, and instead of clothes, she was wearing dirty pieces of tarpaulin. It was Maya Thorne, a student who disappeared without a trace in these canyons exactly 1 year ago and was long considered dead. But when paramedics tried to help her, they noticed a detail that turned a miracle of rescue into the beginning of a terrifying investigation. Maya was clutching an old leather backpack that did not belong to her. Inside were the documents of a tourist who had died in this desert 5 years ago. On May 12, 2015, the morning in Henderson, Nevada, began with the usual desert heat. At 6:30, 22-year-old geology student Maya Thorne left her apartment. She was no ordinary tourist looking for beautiful views to post on social media. Maya was preparing a thesis on the structure of sandstone in the Red Rock Canyon Nature Reserve and treated this trip as a serious expedition. Neighbors saw her loading her equipment into the trunk of her silver Subaru Outback. She looked focused and calm. Her preparations were professional. Her Osprey backpack contained a Garmin GPS navigator, an expanded first aid kit, a hydrator with a 3-liter water supply, and a professional Canon camera. Maya knew that the desert was unforgiving, so she always took everything she needed to survive off-grid for a day. The drive to the reserve took about 40 minutes. Before entering the park, at 7:45, Maya made a stop at the Desert Edge Outfitters gear store. Surveillance cameras inside the store recorded her looking at a display of climbing equipment. The salesperson on duty that morning would later testify to the police. According to him, the girl spent a long time looking at a map of the northern sector of the park, asking clarifying questions about the passability of routes in the Brownstone Canyon area. Eventually, she purchased 2 new steel carabiners and a 50-foot coil of belay rope. At 8:15 in the morning, cameras at the preserve's checkpoint captured Maya's car entering Scenic Loop Drive, a one-way loop road that circles the main body of the park. 20 minutes later, she parked the car in the Sandstone Quarry parking lot. This place served as the starting point for several challenging routes. The hiker's logbook at the trailhead has a handwritten entry. In the route column, Maya indicated Turtlehead Peak, but added a note: possible deviation to Calico, Tennessee Canyon if weather is favorable. The time to start the hike was 8 hours and 40 minutes in the morning. At 9:30, Maya's mother's phone received a short message. At the spot, connection is bad, we'll be back for dinner. This was the last electronic trace left by the girl. Her phone did not register online anymore. The alarm began around 11 o'clock in the evening, when Maya did not return home and did not get in touch. Her parents, knowing their daughter's punctuality, did not wait for the morning and contacted the Las Vegas police. The officer on duty, given that the girl was alone in the desert, broke the standard waiting protocol and immediately passed the information on to the park rangers. The search operation started at dawn on May 13th. The first find was Maya's car. The Subaru was in the same parking lot where it had been left the day before. The car was locked. During the inspection of the passenger seat, a pair of replacement sneakers and a wallet with documents and cash were found on the passenger seat. This excluded the version of escape or voluntary disappearance. Maya went to the mountains, intending to return. Over the next 7 days, the reserve turned into a large-scale search operation. 40 volunteers from the Clark County Search and Rescue Team, dog handlers, and a helicopter combed the rugged terrain of the Tuttlehead Peak area. Daytime temperatures reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit, making it very difficult for people and dogs to work. On May 15th, the canine team reported the first serious lead. The dogs picked up a trail from the car door and led the search team north. However, instead of following the marked trail to the peak, the trail took a sharp turn toward the La Madre Mountain Wilderness, an area rarely visited by ordinary tourists due to the lack of trails and difficult rocky terrain. The dogs steadily followed the trail for about 2 miles until the group reached a large rocky outcrop at the foot of a sheer cliff. There the animals stopped. They circled in place, nervous, but unable to determine a further direction. The trail ended so suddenly, as if the Maya had simply disappeared from the surface of the earth in this place. A careful examination of the scree yielded only one piece of evidence. Between 2 large boulders lay a shiny steel carbine. It was brand new, with no scratches or signs of oxidation. The barcode label was still glued to the metal. Later, a check against the store's database confirmed that it was one of the carbines Maya had bought on the morning of her disappearance. It was the only thing found during the entire operation. There were no traces of blood, pieces of clothing, signs of a struggle or fall from a height. A helicopter equipped with a thermal imager flew over square after square every night, scanning every crevice and cave, but the screens remained dark. All known routes and dangerous blind spots in Brownstone Canyon were checked by professional climbers. Investigators worked out various versions, from an accident and falling into a deep crevasse to an attack by wild animals or a criminal offense. However, the absence of a body and any other evidence except for the lone carbine led the investigation to a dead end. No witnesses could be found who had seen the girl directly on the route. On May 25, 2015, 2 weeks after the disappearance, the active phase of the search was officially terminated. The official police report classified the case as a disappearance under unexplained circumstances. The rescuers left the canyon, leaving Maya's parents alone with the silence of the red rocks. The desert had safely hidden its secret, leaving no hint of the girl's fate. But rumors began to circulate among the rangers who took part in the operation about the strange behavior of the dogs on that scree. They not only lost the trail, they were afraid to go further, as if they felt the presence of something that did not belong to the natural world. By May of 2016, the file with Maya Thorne's name on it was covered in a layer of archival dust at the Las Vegas Police Department. Exactly 12 months of silence turned a high-profile disappearance into another grouse, a statistical unit in reports of accidents in national parks. The girl's parents continued to post flyers, but even the most experienced detectives privately admitted that the Mojave Desert rarely returns those it has taken, and if it does so only in the form of sun-bleached bones. Everything changed on May 14, 2016. At 10:15 in the morning, Robert Miller, a long-haul truck driver, was driving along State Route 159, which runs along the eastern edge of Red Rock Canyon. The sun was already high, and the hot air was creating a haze effect on the asphalt. In his statement to the patrol, Miller later said that at first he thought the figure on the side of the road was a play of light or a tumbleweed. but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. A girl was walking on the hot asphalt, barely moving her feet. She was barefoot, and her body was covered in strange rags, a mixture of faded gray tarpaulin and the remains of what might once have been tourist clothes. The driver braked sharply and ran out onto the road. According to him, the girl did not even flinch at the sound of the air brakes. She kept walking, looking through him with a 1,000-yard stare. Her skin resembled old parchment, her lips were chapped to the point of bleeding, and her exposed areas were covered with a grid of small scars and burns that had already begun to heal. At 10:27, the dispatcher received a call. The first to arrive was a team of paramedics from the nearest station in Summerlin. In her report, paramedic Sarah Jenkins noted the patient's critical condition: severe dehydration, third-degree exhaustion, and signs of heat stroke. However, the doctors were struck by something else. Despite the fact that the girl had obviously spent a long time in the wild, she did not have any serious bone fractures, which would have been inevitable in a fall in the canyon. When they tried to put her on a stretcher, she reacted for the first time. She clutched the object she was holding in her hands convulsively, until her knuckles were white. It was an old, battered leather backpack that looked like an alien element in this picture. The paramedics had to use force to unclench her fingers as she began to make throaty, growling sounds, refusing to give up her burden. The police officers who arrived next made a preliminary identification. Fingerprints taken with a mobile scanner gave an instant match in the missing persons database. It was Maya Thorne. The girl, who was searched for a year ago with helicopters and dogs, returned from the desert alone. She was silent. Doctors had preliminarily diagnosed her with dissociative fugue and severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But the real shock came when the detectives examined the backpack Maya had fought so hard for. It was not her modern Osprey with which she went hiking a year ago. It was an old model made of rough leather that had long since fallen out of use. They found neither water nor food inside. There were only 2 items inside. The first was a plastic bag with documents, an Arizona driver's license in the name of Greg Sullivan. The detective who was inventorying the evidence immediately recognized the name. Greg Sullivan was a 30-year-old chemical engineer who disappeared in the same area in 2011. 5 years ago, the search for him had yielded no results, and the official version remained an accident, a fall from a height, after which his body was covered with stones or taken by wild animals. The second item in the backpack was a heavy geological hammer with an elongated handle. The tool looked old, the metal darkened with time. But it was not the age of the tool that attracted the experts' attention. The hammer's striker and part of the handle were covered with a dried, dark brown substance. An on-site rapid test confirmed the biological origin of the stains. It was blood. Maya Thorne did not just return from the world of the dead. She brought with her proof that Greg Sullivan's disappearance 5 years ago was not a tragic accident. She was silent, but the things she brought back from the depths of the canyon screamed of a crime that had remained hidden for a decade and a half. And the worst part was that the blood on the hammer looked like it had dried for a long time. Dear friends, before we continue to dive into this gruesome story, I want to ask you for one important thing. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like this video. It will only take you a few seconds, but it is your activity that signals to YouTube's algorithms to promote this content. This way, more people will be able to see our story, and together we will solve this mystery. Thank you for your support. June 2016. The Sunrise Recovery Center, a private clinic located on the outskirts of Las Vegas, has become a temporary refuge for Maya Thorne. Detective Mark Hall, who was tasked by police authorities to reopen the investigation, visited the facility every day for 2 weeks. However, communication with the key and only witness reached a dead end. Maya refused to talk. She would sit on her bed for hours, rocking back and forth in a monotonous manner, and stare at a single point on the wall. Her silence was heavier than a scream. The doctors who conducted a full examination of the patient found changes on her body that had occurred during the year of her absence. In addition to scars and marks from healed burns, strange tattoos appeared on the inside of the girl's left forearm. They were made in a crude, artisanal way, probably with an ordinary needle and soot or ink from a ballpoint pen. These were not artistic drawings, but chaotic rows of numbers and complex chemical formulas scrawled in uneven, trembling handwriting just under the skin. Any attempts by the staff or the detective to ask Maya about their meaning caused her to have bouts of uncontrollable panic. She started scratching her hands, trying to erase the inscriptions, so doctors had to use sedatives. Her only way of communication was through drawings. Detective Hall, on the advice of a psychiatrist, began bringing her blank paper and charcoal pencils. Instead of the sun, trees, or a house that patients usually draw during rehabilitation, Maya drew complex diagrams. Sheet after sheet, she drew endless labyrinths, intertwining narrow corridors, vertical shafts, and dark rooms without windows. It looked like a detailed plan of some underground complex drawn from memory. Meanwhile, the Las Vegas Police Crime Laboratory completed the initial analysis of the physical evidence recovered from the old leather backpack. The geological hammer became the key to the solution that shocked investigators. The examination confirmed the worst guesses. The dark brown substance that had eaten into the metal of the hammer was indeed human blood. The DNA test gave a 100% match to the genetic profile of Greg Sullivan, a tourist who disappeared in the area 5 years ago. This fact instantly reclassified the case from a disappearance to a murder. But even more questions were raised by an in-depth chemical analysis of the microparticles found in the microscopic cracks in the metal on the hammer. Laboratory technicians found traces of a rare blue clay that is found in this region only at great depths in specific geological formations inaccessible from the surface. But the most alarming finding was the clear traces of reprocessed uranium. The radiation background of the instrument was within normal limits, but the presence of ore particles indicated contact with radioactive materials. The psychiatrist, Dr. Evans, who was treating the patient, told Detective Hall about her disturbing observations during her nightly shifts. According to her, Maya hardly slept, and when she did fall into a short, disturbing sleep, she kept repeating the same phrase, "The mine is breathing." This was not a delusion about the forest or the open space of the desert. The tone and context pointed to an irrational fear of confined spaces and suffocation. In one of the last drawings made that week, Maya depicted a tall human figure standing in the center of one of the tunnels. The figure's face was completely hidden by a bulky gas mask or industrial respirator, and his body was wrapped in what looked like a protective suit. Next to the figure, she wrote a single short word with a trembling hand, pressing the pencil so hard that the stylus broke. Chemist. Detective Hall put all the available facts together. The tattoo with formulas on the victim's arm, the traces of uranium and clay on the hammer, the obsessive drawings of tunnels, and the mysterious figure in the respirator. The picture began to form a whole, and it was terrifying. It became obvious that Maya Thorne had not been wandering the desert for a whole year, hiding from the sun under the bushes. She had been deep underground all this time, in a place that is not on any modern tourist map. And most importantly, she was not there alone. When the detective laid out an old topographic map of the 50s mining area in front of her, Maya looked up at him for the first time. Her finger, slowly, as if overcoming enormous resistance, slid across the paper and stopped at a point where nothing was officially supposed to exist. July of 2016 was a turning point in an investigation that had long since gone beyond the scope of a simple kidnapping case. While Maya Thorne remained silent in the clinic room, Detective Mark Hall focused all his attention on the silent witness the girl had carried out of the desert: a leather backpack. The name on the found documents, Greg Sullivan, became the thread that led to the darkness of 5 years ago. The investigative team recovered boxes of files from the archives that contained the case file on Sullivan's disappearance, dating back to 2011. At the time, the police quickly closed the case, writing it off as an accident in the mountains. But now, looking at the old reports from a new angle, detectives have noticed details that had been ignored before. Greg Sullivan was not an ordinary amateur hiker. The 30-year-old man worked as a leading chemical engineer for a large industrial corporation in Arizona and had a serious hobby: caving. In his profile, colleagues noted that Greg was obsessed with finding rare minerals and often spent weekends exploring old caves and grottos. His professional skills as a chemist and knowledge of geology made him an ideal target for someone looking for skilled labor for specific tasks. In parallel with the investigation of Sullivan's background, Detective Hall initiated an extensive review of the region's mapping data. The police made a request to the U.S. Geological Survey and the local Historical Society. The resulting maps from the 50s of the last century revealed another side of the reserve that was not mentioned in tourist brochures. It turned out that the picturesque rocks hid an industrial past. In the area of Blue Diamond Hill, which is located within a radius of 50 kilometers from the site of Maya's disappearance, gypsum was actively mined in the mid-20th century. In addition to the official quarries, maps indicated the existence of a network of exploration adits that had the status of secret facilities during the Cold War. In the 80s, funding ceased. The entrances to the mines were blown up or blocked with stones, and the documentation was archived. These abandoned dungeons created an ideal blind spot where anything could be hidden, from contraband to people. But the most important question remained: who could restore access to these labyrinths and equip the functional complex that Maya had drawn there? Detective Hall suggested that to create an underground base, even a handicraft one, specific equipment was needed: ventilation systems, powerful generators, drilling rigs. This is not something you buy in a regular hardware store. Investigators began checking auctions of decommissioned industrial equipment and reports on large private purchases for the period from 2009 to 2012. After a week of hard work, the analysts found a suspicious transaction. In October of 2010, a year before chemist Sullivan disappeared, a private citizen purchased a decommissioned but working mine ventilation system, 2 industrial-grade diesel generators, and a set of hydraulic tools for working with hard rock. The buyer was listed as Arthur Vance. This name was immediately checked against the databases. The dossier on the 52-year-old Vance looked like a portrait of a man teetering on the edge of insanity. He was a former shift supervisor at the Silver State Mining Company. His personnel file was full of reprimands for safety violations. His colleagues described him as an aggressive, paranoid person who believed that the government was hiding the true deposits of strategic resources. He was scandalously fired in 2009 after a fight with an inspector who forbade Vance to conduct unauthorized blasting operations. After his dismissal, Arthur Vance sold his apartment in the city and moved to the remote Dusty Creek Ranch, located in the desert west of Red Rock Park. It was the perfect place for a hermit. No neighbors for miles around, just sand and rocks. However, when the police tried to establish his current whereabouts, it turned out that there was no one to look for. Officially, Arthur Vance had been missing for 4 years. The county fire department reports for 2012 contained information about a large-scale fire at the Dusty Creek Ranch. The fire completely destroyed the house and outbuildings. The owner's body was not found, but the investigation concluded that Vance could have died in the fire, and his remains were completely destroyed by high temperatures. Or he faked his death to escape from his numerous debts. The case was closed, and the ashes were left to the desert winds. Detective Hall, sensing that he had found a key link, demanded a detailed report from the forensic scientists who had examined the site 4 years earlier. Reading the description of the items found on the ashes, he felt a chill run down his spine. The list of burned items included the remains of furniture, household appliances, and personal belongings. But the list completely lacked what Vance had bought with such fanaticism. There were no generators, no ventilation units, no expensive drills at the scene of the fire. This meant only one thing. The heavy industrial equipment, weighing several tons, did not burn. It was removed from the ranch before the first match was lit. Arthur Vance did not die in the fire. He just moved. And judging by Maya's drawings and the profile of the missing chemist, he did not move to another house, but went underground, taking with him everything he needed to create his own hell. August 2016 was the month when the silence was finally broken. Within the walls of the Sunrise Recovery Center clinic, an event occurred that the investigation had been waiting for almost 90 days. Maya Thorne, who had previously communicated only through drawings and monosyllabic sounds, spoke in full sentences for the first time. Her testimony was recorded on a tape recorder in the presence of a psychiatrist and Detective Hall. This recording, which lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes, became a chronicle of the hell that existed right under the feet of the tourists. The girl's voice was quiet, hoarse, and mechanical, as if she was reading instructions for a complicated device rather than telling about her own abduction. According to Maya, on that fateful day, May 12, 2015, she did deviate from the route. Her attention was drawn to an unusual shine in the rock at the foot of the cliff, the outcrop of a layer of rare blue clay mixed with crystals of an unknown mineral. Her geological excitement made her climb up the scree into a blind spot invisible from the main trail. There, behind an overhanging eave, she found what she thought was a natural cave. But when she got closer, she realized that it was an artificial vent, disguised as a stone with a painted metal mesh. She didn't even have time to get scared. A figure in dirty protective overalls and a full-face respirator emerged from the darkness of the opening. Maya remembers a sharp hissing sound, the smell of sweetish gas, and then a blow and darkness. She came to when she was deep underground. What Maya had called the labyrinth in her drawings turned out to be a complex system of converted Cold War mining adits. Her captor, Arthur Vance, whom she called exclusively the chemist, transformed the abandoned tunnels into a functional underground complex. He restored the old ventilation system, connected diesel generators, and set up a laboratory to enrich the rare earth elements and uranium he was illegally mining from the canyon's interior. Vance was not just a crazed sadist, he was a pragmatic sociopath. He didn't want victims for entertainment. He wanted free labor. He called his captives moles. According to Maya, a mole's workday lasted 14 hours. Their task was to chisel hard rock in narrow side drifts where machinery could not get through, and to drag bags of ore to the central enrichment chamber. But the most frightening discovery for the investigation was that Maya was not the first and not the only one there. When she was first thrown into the living quarters, a damp stone niche barred by rebar, she saw a man there. It was Greg Sullivan. The man who had been presumed dead for 5 years was alive, or at least he existed. Maya described Greg as a shadow of a man. During the 4 years of his underground captivity, he lost half his weight. His skin became gray and translucent. His hair fell out in patches, and his body was covered with sores from constant contact with toxic dust and radioactive rock. He coughed constantly, spitting out black phlegm, and could hardly walk. Greg was an elder mole, but his resources were exhausted. Vance created a rigid system of survival in the dungeon. Water and food were not a right, they were a salary. If you don't dig, you don't eat, was the only rule of the labyrinth. For any offense, for stopping during work or trying to talk, the punishment was deprivation of water for 24 hours. In the dry underground air saturated with chemicals, this was worse than a beating. In the second part of her testimony, Maya moved on to what changed her forever. She described how Vance broke her psyche not with pain, but with choice. A month after her kidnapping, when Vance's food supplies were running low, he confronted her with the fact that there was only enough food for one full-time worker. Vance brought 1 can of canned meat and put it in the middle of the cell. He said that today, only those who could defend or earn it would receive the bonus. Greg was too weak to fight. He just lay on a bed of dirty rags and looked at Maya with sunken eyes. He did not ask, did not beg. He just waited. Maya admitted to the investigator that something broke in her at that moment. The instinct of self-preservation drowned out her humanity. She did not share the food. She did not give it to the dying man. She ate it all by herself, under the watchful eye of the supervisor in the respirator. That night, for the first time, Vance did not lock her shackles at night. He said, "Now you realize the value of the resource. You are becoming useful." It was the beginning of her transformation. Maya spoke about it without emotion, but her hands were shaking so badly that the table she was sitting at vibrated. She admitted that over time she began to see Greg not as a companion in misfortune, but as a burden that took away her share of water and air. Vance saw this and encouraged her, assigning her to look after the weak link. Detective Hall listened to this confession, realizing that he was no longer a victim, but someone else. Someone forged by the labyrinth. Maya ended her story with a phrase that hung in the silence of the office like a heavy sentence. There is no morality down there. There is only efficiency. And I wanted to be efficient to survive. But she was silent about what happened next, when Greg finally lost the ability to hold the kalo in his hands. Preparations for the operation, codenamed Obsidian, took nearly 3 weeks. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, together with the Las Vegas Police Department, developed a detailed plan for the assault based on Maya Thorne's testimony and archival geological maps from the 50s. On September 12, 2016, at 4 o'clock in the morning, a convoy of black tactical vans without insignia set off toward Black Velvet Canyon. This was one of the most remote and least explored parts of the reserve, which had a reputation among local rangers as a dead zone, a place where radio communication disappeared and cell phones turned into useless plastic. The seizure team, consisting of 25 SWAT officers and federal agents, operated in complete silence. Even with the exact coordinates Maya had provided on the map, finding the entrance proved to be a challenge. What looked like a chaotic natural sandstone scree and a pile of boulders from a distance of 10 paces turned out to be an ingenious engineering camouflage structure upon closer inspection. The huge, flat stone blocking the passage moved on hidden hydraulic hinges. When the assault team activated the mechanism, the rock moved silently, revealing the black mouth of the tunnel, which was filled with cold and the smell of diesel fuel. The soldiers went inside, ready for armed resistance, but they were greeted only by an eerie silence, broken by the steady hum of industrial ventilation. What they saw shocked even the veterans of forensic science. It was not a primitive hole of a mad hermit. It was a high-tech underground complex. The walls of the old adits were reinforced with modern polymeric materials and concrete screeds. Thick cables stretched under the ceiling, leading to the generator room, where 2 powerful diesel engines worked, providing light and energy to the entire labyrinth. In the central room, which Maya called the workshop, investigators found a full-fledged chemical laboratory. Stainless steel tables, centrifuges for ore enrichment, sealed containers with radioactive hazard labels, and cabinets with professional protective suits all testified to the industrial scale of the criminal activity. Arthur Vance did not just hide here, he built an underground empire. While inspecting the residential sector, a series of niches carved into the rock and closed with steel bars, the agents made another gruesome discovery. In one of the metal tool cabinets, they found a cardboard box, which the investigators immediately dubbed the trophy box. Inside were not jewelry, but personal belongings: worn wallets, wristwatches, key binders, and driver's licenses. A quick check of the documents on the spot revealed the names of 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman who had been missing in Nevada and California since 2008. Their cases had long been gathering dust in the archives as accidents. Now it became apparent that these people were Vance's first moles, whose lives ended in the darkness of these tunnels long before Greg and Maya appeared. However, the main target of the raid was Arthur Vance himself and his prisoners. But the complex was empty. Not a single living soul. The coffee in the mug on the lab table was moldy, and a layer of dust on the work surfaces indicated that no one had been here for at least a few weeks. Vance had disappeared, leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment on, as if he planned to leave for a minute, but never returned. The search team moved inland, checking every branch. In the farthest northern tunnel, which was a dead end in the rock, the sniffer dog gave a voice. The passage was partially blocked with stones, not a natural collapse, but a neatly stacked barricade. As the soldiers cleared the blockage, the light of tactical flashlights snatched human remains from the darkness. The body lay in an unnatural position against the wall, half covered with rubble. The skin had mummified in the dry air of the mine, but the clothes, the remains of a worker's overalls, allowed for a preliminary identification. It was Greg Sullivan. The initial examination of the body on the spot was conducted by a forensic expert who arrived with the special forces. The victim's skull had characteristic injuries. It was a deep dent with divergent cracks in the frontal part, which could only have been caused by a heavy, blunt object with a small area of damage. The expert attached to the wound a printed photograph of the striker of the same geological hammer that Maya Thorne had brought out of the desert. The shape and size matched perfectly. Greg Sullivan died instantly from one crushing blow. The news of the empty compound and the found body instantly flew over the radio waves to headquarters. The police put Arthur Vance on the federal wanted list. An APB with his 10-year-old photo was sent to all patrol crews in 3 states. The investigation assumed the most logical scenario. After learning about Maya's escape in May, the chemist realized that exposure was inevitable, eliminated the remaining evidence, and fled, changing his appearance and documents. But Detective Mark Hall, standing in the middle of the empty underground laboratory, felt that something was missing from the picture. If Vance had escaped, why had he left the generators running, burning scarce fuel? Why didn't he take his trophy archive that directly pointed to his serial crimes? And most importantly, why was the entrance gateway locked from the inside with a mechanical bolt that could only be opened from the tunnel? It seemed that the owner of the dungeon did not go outside. October of 2016 brought the cold clarity that the investigation had been lacking. After a botched raid and the discovery of Greg Sullivan's body in an empty compound, Detective Mark Hall returned to the Sunrise Recovery Center. This time, he came not as a sympathetic listener, but as an investigator with irrefutable evidence. The atmosphere in the interview room had changed. Instead of soft light and pencils, a thick folder with forensic reports lay on the table. Hall knew that this interrogation would be decisive. He sat down across from Maya Thorne and silently laid out the photographs of Greg Sullivan's skull taken at the morgue in front of her. The examination gave a clear answer to the question of how the man died. The nature of the damage to the frontal bone indicated that the blow was not inflicted in the turmoil of the struggle and not from the back. The killer was standing right in front of the victim, looking him in the eye. Greg did not defend himself, did not raise his hands to cover his head. He either trusted the man holding the hammer or was so broken that he accepted his fate. The detective asked only one question, but it sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the room. Vance couldn't get that close to him without resistance. Greg hated him. Who was holding the hammer, Maya? This question broke down the last barrier she had been building in her mind for 5 months of rehabilitation. Her shoulders shook, and a confession fell from her lips that turned a story of survival into a tragedy of moral failure. According to Maya, it all happened in April of 2016, about a month before she appeared on the highway. Greg Sullivan, exhausted from years of labor and toxic dust, finally collapsed. He could no longer hold his pickaxe, his lungs were wheezing, and every movement was painful. For Arthur Vance, who was guided exclusively by the logic of efficiency, this meant only one thing: the resource was exhausted. One evening, the chemist entered their cell. He did not shout or threaten. In a calm, casual tone, he delivered an ultimatum that Maya memorized word for word. "The ballast is dragging us all down," Vance said, looking at the half-conscious Greg. "We're running low on water. Either you get rid of it and prove you want to live, or I'll wall you both up in the lower adit and you'll die of thirst for a week." He threw his old geological hammer on the floor and walked out, leaving the door unlocked. Maya talked about the next few minutes while looking at her hands. She admitted that Greg was conscious. He understood everything. When she picked up the hammer, he whispered, barely audibly, "Do it." This was not a murder in the heat of the moment. It was a cold, calculated choice between the life of one and the death of two. She struck once, hard, exactly as geology had taught her, in the center of the target. When Vance came back and saw what he had done, he showed no joy or satisfaction. He nodded and said only one word: promotion. From that moment on, Maya's status in the dungeon changed dramatically. She was no longer just a mole. She became an accomplice, connected to the chemist by blood. Vance began to trust her. He no longer locked her in a cage at night, allowed her to eat normal food, and, most importantly, started taking her with him to the upper levels. He needed an assistant to measure the radiation background near the ventilation exits to the surface. He was sure that he had broken her will completely, that fear and guilt had tied her to him tighter than any chains. It was his fatal mistake. Maya waited. She endured, watched, and played the role of a submissive assistant, lulling her executioner's vigilance. On May 14, 2016, during a routine visit to the ventilation shaft to change the filters, the moment of truth came. They were in a narrow, technical collector that ran vertically upward to the surface. Vance stood at the edge of a deep pit, a ventilation shaft that led to the lower, flooded levels of the mine. He was distracted by adjusting the dosimeter and turned his back on Maya for a moment. There was no heroism in her story, only the pure mechanics of survival. She did not hesitate. Maya pushed him in the back with all her strength. She heard a scream, the sound of his body hitting the metal staples somewhere below, and then silence. She did not look down. She did not check to see if he was alive. She grabbed his backpack, which she knew contained documents from previous victims, and climbed up into the light that was coming through the rusty grate. Detective Hall sat still, digesting what he had heard. His brain was feverishly comparing the facts. The police had searched for Vance all over the country, put him on a federal manhunt, and closed state lines. They thought he had fled, taking the money and changing his name. But if Maya's words are true, then the chemist didn't run away. He never left the canyon. All this time, while the SWAT team was storming the empty lab, while FBI agents were combing the airports, Arthur Vance was much closer. Hall stood up, feeling his pulse quicken. He remembered the map of the tunnels they had drawn up during the raid. It marked one deep vertical pit in the northern sector that was considered abandoned and dangerous to descend. If Maya was not lying, the answer to the last question of this case lies at the bottom of that mine. And there is a possibility that in May, when the girl was getting to the surface, the story of Arthur Vance was not yet over. On November 2nd, 2016, the silence of Black Velvet Canyon was once again broken by the rumble of heavy machinery and the noise of police helicopter propellers. Following Maya Thorne's detailed testimony, the investigative team led by Detective Mark Hall returned to the underground complex to find the final piece of this horrific puzzle. This time, the goal of the operation was not to storm the laboratory, but to descend into the abyss that Maya herself called the throat. According to the coordinates provided by the girl, Arthur Vance's body was at the bottom of a vertical ventilation pit in the northern sector of the mine. The recovery operation was entrusted to an elite unit of the Nevada State Mining Rescue Service. The difficulty was that the walls of the old well, drilled back in the 50s, were extremely unstable, and the depth reached 40 meters. At 11:30, the first rescuer, attached to a steel winch cable, began his descent into the darkness. Radio communication was intermittent due to the high iron content in the rock, but after 20 minutes, a short signal was received on the surface. The object was visually confirmed. At the bottom of the stone bag, among the fragments of rusty rebar and debris, was the body of a man in a protective coverall. It took almost 2 hours to get him up. When the stretcher with the body was finally brought to the surface and laid on the rocks, Detective Hall immediately recognized Arthur Vance, despite the severe changes caused by decomposition. A dosimeter, a broken flashlight, and a tool belt were found on his person. However, the real horror of the situation was not revealed there, at the entrance to the mine, but 3 days later, in the sterile room of the Clark County morgue. On November 5th, the chief medical examiner signed a report that made even experienced investigators shudder. The autopsy showed that the fall from a 40-meter height did not cause the chemist's instant death. Vance landed on a pile of construction waste, which softened the impact. He suffered open fractures of both shin bones, a pelvic fracture, and a compression injury to his spine, which rendered him immobile but did not kill him. No food was found in the victim's stomach, but the marks on the walls of the mine below showed a desperate struggle for life. The nails on Vance's hands were torn off. He was trying to crawl up the steep wall using only his arm strength. The examination found that the cause of death was critical dehydration and painful shock. But the most frightening thing was the date of death. According to pathologists' calculations, Arthur Vance died in complete darkness and agony within 4 or 5 days of the fall. This meant that on May 14, 2016, when the truck driver found Maya on the highway, and even on May 15, when she was already safely in the intensive care unit, her executioner was still alive. He was lying at the bottom of the well, screaming and calling for help, hoping that his assistant would return or send someone. Maya knew about it. She knew that he had not died from the impact because she heard his moans as she crawled to the surface. And she consciously chose to remain silent, leaving him to die a long and agonizing death. The trial in the case of the state of Nevada versus Maya Thorne began in January 2017 and was held in camera. The prosecutor's office found itself in a difficult situation. On the one hand, the girl committed the murder of Greg Sullivan and left Arthur Vance in danger. On the other hand, the defense presented exhaustive evidence that all her actions were dictated by the instinct of survival under extreme psychological and physical pressure. The lawyers emphasized the state of extreme necessity. A psychiatric examination confirmed the defendant's deep Stockholm syndrome and personality changes as a result of prolonged torture by starvation and isolation. The jury was shown photographs of the underground cells and Vance's diary found in the laboratory, where he coldly described the methods of breaking the will of his moles. In the case of Greg Sullivan's death, the court found that Maya acted under a direct threat to her own life when Vance put her in a position to choose between being killed or being buried alive. As for Vance's own death, the jury characterized it as an act of self-defense that extended over time. Maya's silence about surviving the fall was interpreted as a result of traumatic shock and fear that the chemist could somehow reach her even from the bottom of the mine. On February 16, 2017, the judge announced the verdict. Maya Thorne was fully acquitted of all charges. She left the courtroom a free but broken person. She refused to speak to the press, did not give any interviews, and rejected offers to write a book about her experiences. A month after the trial, Maya sold all her property in Henderson, changed her name, and moved to another state on the East Coast, where the climate and landscape were radically different from the Mojave Desert. Friends and acquaintances lost touch with her. She tried to dissolve among millions of people, to erase the sound of a geological hammer and the smell of underground dampness from her memory forever. The Nevada state authorities decided to put an end to the labyrinth's history in a radical way. In March of 2017, a convoy of concrete mixers arrived at Black Velvet Canyon. All of the discovered entrances to the adits, ventilation pits, and natural faults leading to the complex were filled with hundreds of cubic meters of reinforced concrete. Hiking trails in this sector of the park were officially removed from the maps, and the area was fenced off with a high fence with warning signs about radiation hazards and the threat of landslides. Today, the desert again looks the same as it did thousands of years ago, majestic and silent. The wind sweeps away the tracks of heavy machinery, and the sun burns away the memory of what happened under these red rocks. But among the locals and rangers, the story of the girl with the hammer has become a dark legend. They say that concrete can close the entrance to the mine, but it cannot drown out the echoes. Sometimes, when the night wind blows through the canyon, people think they hear the sound of metal on stone, a sound that reminds them of how the desert can turn an innocent victim into an executioner for the sake of a single sip of water.